let's go ahead and bring in CBS News national correspondent Lilia Luciano, who is braving the cold there. Negative temperatures there in Minneapolis. What else did we hear from Bovino and the other federal officials who briefed you?
I think the important points are what we didn't hear from the officials, and that is any details about exactly what happened. Bovino was pressed about the place of the gun, whether Alex Pretti had the gun in his hand, whether he had reached for it, was he armed. Bovino would not go into detail about what exactly happened, other than defending the actions of the officers and saying that they had to make a decision within a few seconds. He said that the investigation will lead to those facts. We are still unclear, and CBS News has pressed the administration on who is leading this investigation. It seems it is DHS itself who is investigating itself at this point. But I think those details are what people really want to hear about. I mean, if the gun was first retrieved and then Pretti was shot, then was that justified, and who is investigating that? I think the rest of the press conference, Bovino went into a philosophical conversation about choices. It seems like he just wanted to keep things pretty generic, talking about the choices of immigrants coming into the country and the choices of people who have been protesting here. Seems to have kind of blamed in both cases the protesters who were shot and killed by federal agents, and talking about those choices that they made. I think right now what we have been hearing from people on the ground is a great deal of frustration at the lack of details about the investigation, and this press conference did not really shed any light on that. The officers were pressed on exactly what led to the shooting. They would not really divulge any other information about that. They were asked a series of questions about what comes next and who is handling the investigation, and that's also something that they just left open, but really did stress this word choices, this idea that people make choices. And the other thing that Bovino went into was that the agents who were there were there as part of an operation to target and to remove a criminal, undocumented immigrant, and they seem to, and Bovino seemed to indicate that Pretti was, as they said before, or as they alleged before, the administration was in some way stopping that. We are waiting to hear more from the administration, waiting to hear more from DHS about both what happened, what was the position of this gun. We have seen the videos, but they seem to initially, in their initial narrative, seem to contradict what we have seen in the videos, and also who is leading this investigation. There was a lot that we expected to hear today that was not specifically addressed in the conference, and that Bovino said the facts will come later as the investigation continues.
And play a little bit of what we heard in that press conference.
Our Title VIII immigration mission continues unabated here in Minneapolis, despite yesterday's tragedy that was preventable by folks making better choices, politicians, journalists, and would-be anarchists and rioters.
What's the mood on the ground?
Well, we have seen, despite the bitter cold, we have been seeing protesters. I mean, from the moment, and I just landed today, from the moment I landed, I saw people holding signs against ICE on the highway. We've seen several protesters walking around here. And there was a really interesting scene earlier as Bovino walked into the federal building. There are many protesters out there who were chanting shame to those federal officials as they went into the federal building. So there have continued to be protests, and we expect that those will go on. throughout the weekend and throughout the week. Where we are right now near downtown, it's a little bit quieter. I assume the majority of people are concentrated in that building. But something that we found really interesting is, look, I tried to get to the press conference. I landed with little time. There are a lot of restrictions, and the way that journalists who went into the press conference and went into the federal building are accessing that is extremely limited. There's you have to RSVP. You have to go through where the protesters are. It's complicated security-wise. There's no space for parking, for crews, for security. So it's a very intricate and different scene from what we've seen when we cover other types of press conferences. To the point that I was asking our producers who've been covering it, how complicated is it to get in there, and they said it seems intentional to. That we as journalists have to go through all of those steps to cover the press conference, many limitations on the building, on accessing it, and having to go through the areas where the protests are. You get a real feel of how much tension and growing tension there is here. And it seems that that DHS and the people holding the conference also want to make sure that journalists potentially go through the same kind of pressure that they're facing.
Lilia, thank you. Let's turn now to CBS News Homeland Security correspondent Nicole Sganga, who's been following this closely. Nicole, anything else that you wanted to pick up on in what we heard from either Walls or Bovino?
Well, I think, look, we did hear a different tone from U.S. Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bovino. As Lilia pointed out quite articulately, there were a lot of questions and remain a lot of questions regarding the nature of the investigation. But if you compare what CBP Commander Bovino's response was to the Renee Good shooting to what we just heard with regard to the Alex Pretti shooting, you are now hearing officials within the Department of Homeland Security saying that they're going to reserve some of their judgment, or at least articulation of what happened on the ground, until the investigation is carried out, which I do think is notable. There is a sense perhaps now that the public outrage has been overwhelming, and there needs to be a step back from law enforcement to really assess what exactly happened in the moments leading up to that fatal shooting of, by all accounts, a man who was there to observe a law enforcement operation and to document it, and was wielding really nothing but his phone. Of course, he was legally carrying a firearm on him. And so I do think it is notable that you hear multiple references to the investigation coming from DHS officials there. We still do need to know who is leading this criminal investigation. We are told that FBI is assisting, that they have collected from some evidence from the scene, including at least one firearm, and that's being processed at their labs in Quantico right now, and they'll be working with DHS, but we still have questions about what DHS component will be leading this. Is it U.S. Customs and Border Protection? Is it ICE? Is it HSI, which is the investigative arm of Homeland Security? So we are following up there. Now, as for the press conference that was held at the same time by Governor Walz, by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, another interesting point there, and they also had the Minnesota Department of Corrections Commissioner Paul Schnell, was that pushback on the fact that DHS claims state and local law enforcement is not cooperating with immigration authorities. And we heard from both the Minnesota Attorney General and the governor there, who said, look, we're not here to do the job of ICE. Immigration is a federal authority, but we are willing partners. We have been notifying ICE when criminals are released from state prisons so that they can transfer custody to federal law enforcement. And we will work to get criminals off the street. What we are pushing back on now is not immigration enforcement. It's the manner in which this immigration enforcement has been carried out. And we've heard, similar things from Minnesotans, from folks in Minneapolis on the street who have been protesting. I was there for several days last week. It's not that individuals within Minnesota or Minnesota leaders are against lawful immigration enforcement. What they are calling out is the tactics and the nature of these law enforcement operations that are happening, these sweeps en masse, the fact that there has been a departure from targeted immigration enforcement operations to trying to conduct collateral arrests, trying to take to very high trafficked urban areas of the city and conducting these sweeps, which has implicated some outraged citizens who are there and showing up in numbers in sub-freezing temperatures, Lindsay.
Nicole, you have also covered the immigration surges in other cities, for example, Los Angeles, Chicago. How did those end? Because I know that that is one thing that state and local officials have been asking there as well. What will it take for this to end? Do previous operations give us any indication? Is there a number that officials are trying to get to in terms of arrests?
Yeah, Lindsay, it's a really important question. And we have been asking this of Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, of Commander Gregory Bovino, of the Executive Associate Director Marcus Charles, who is in charge of the ICE deportation efforts there in Minneapolis. What number of individuals do you need to arrest? What is the goalpost here? Is this about the fraud investigation? Is this about immigration enforcement? Why are federal agents continuing to be on the ground in Minneapolis? And when will they leave? To your question, and just to be clear, we have not gotten a satisfying answer on that front beyond Commander Bovino saying until every individual who is in the state illegally is arrested. That being said, the number of undocumented migrants in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, it's quite small in comparison to other places in Florida and Texas, which again begs this question of why are we here? Now, to your question about Chicago and Los Angeles, which I think is a very good one, is what we saw play out in those cities was the courts basically stepped in. They put temporary injunctions down. We know that Attorney General Keith Ellison mentioned the temporary injunction. There's a hearing tomorrow in his case and the state and the city's case against the Department of Homeland Security, which calls into question the use of less than lethal tactics like pepper balls, pepper spray, tear gas in these law enforcement operations. It prevents this temporary injunction, law enforcement, from arresting protesters who are simply there, who do not pose a direct threat to law enforcement. And so what we saw in Chicago was as the courts made it more challenging, quite frankly, for ICE to carry out its operations in the way they had been carrying them out, we did see a bit of a retreat from the Trump administration in that city. The same goes for Los Angeles. But just to give our viewers here some perspective, what we are seeing in the Twin Cities area, Operation Metro Surge, is the single greatest deployment of federal agents within the Department of Homeland Security in our nation's history. There are well over 3,000 federal agents on the ground. That is about one agent for every 130 people in the city of Minneapolis. That is enormous. And it is far more than the 600 officers within the Minneapolis Police Department, far more even than the combined roughly 1,100 or 1,200 police officers within St. Paul in the Minneapolis Police Department. And that is why you hear leaders in Minnesota and also just everyday citizens who have been protesting and demonstrating talk about the federal occupation. And so what we have seen in Minneapolis is quite distinct from Chicago, from New York, from Baltimore, certainly distinct from other campaigns we have seen in Memphis, in Washington, D.C., in New Orleans, where there has been not only immigration enforcement on the ground, but also FBI, ATF. And it's leading a lot to question, again, why are federal agents on the ground in such large numbers? Is this about fraud or is this about immigration? And when does this come to an end? And just a quick note on the fraud probe. I mean, we sat down with the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to ask her about why agents were on the ground and how that fraud probe is going. Since we had that conversation, more than 10 federal prosecutors have left the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minneapolis, essentially stalling that investigation into federal fraud in social services throughout the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis. So that, with that investigation now flailing, it again begs the question of why have we seen such a massive law enforcement presence on the ground? That simply does not match up with what we're hearing from Homeland Security leaders now.
Okay, Nicole Sganga, thank you very much.